All right. Housekeeping item number 2, not a sales pitch. I did use Wiz theme slides. I met Emily today. I think she's in like graphic design. I am not a graphic designer by any stretch of the imagination. So if I didn't use company theme slides, you would have gotten a lot of browns and yellows and blues and colors that don't go together. And so it would really hit this as a result with theme slides. And then lastly, topic for today is building cloud security programs that can actually ship left. So as an introduction to the topic, and a little bit of a story. I'm married. I'm married 8 years. I have a wife.
I'll keep this one here so that they can hear you from here.
Excellent, thank you. I have a wife, I have a 2-year-old son, and I have a dog. Out of those 3 options, the best person to hear me practice this discussion was my wife. My wife is a wonderful woman, but she's been a nurse for her entire career. She works at Duke Women's Cancer Center, and has zero background or interest whatsoever in cybersecurity and cloud-based cybersecurity. So we had done this conversation about 2 times. She mainly just took notes when I said, like, I don't really know what I want to say there, or I need to work on like a transition point there. And on the 3rd time I go to give it to her, we did this over a couple different nights. I started my introduction and she said, hey, I don't want to be rude. What a shit left me. And I was like, all right, maybe that's a good way to kick off the discussion. So would love to hear from any of you, because I am an interactive person and don't want to hear myself talk for the next 30 or so minutes. What a shift left me to you?
Start early.
Start early.
And that's like just moving security into the DevOps. Yeah.
Moving security into DevOps.
Basically, in the software development lifecycle, we are putting security on the design aspects right from the beginning of the lifecycle.
Exactly.
Security by design.
It's essentially saying that waiting until the point of production and production level systems is not the time to introduce security. The time to introduce security is back at the beginning of the process during the development life cycle. And honestly, as early as possible into the development cycle. So the conversation today is how do we do that as best as possible? And I'm going to let you know a little secret now. I'm going to give away kind of the punchline of this conversation. And the fact is that there's not an easy way to do this, right? I cannot tell you all right now, hey, if you go out and buy this product today, go out, buy Wiz, buy CrowdStrike, buy Rapid7, buy Oracle, buy whoever, that tomorrow your developers are all going to love thinking about security in their day-to-day best practices, right? So that's not going to be the punchline of the conversation, unfortunately, but did want to address that up. Yeah, thank you.
You said you have some nice graphics there.
Yeah.
Just click on the minimize.
Oh, gotcha. I didn't know if we needed to have that.
You don't need to.
This one, can I move?
Yeah.
No, I don't think you can.
Yeah, I don't have you guys on my screen, actually.
That's a room feature, that's feature.
All right, so again, my name is Max Sullivan. I'm a solutions engineer at Wiz. I live right down the road. I actually live in Garner, North Carolina. And who lives in my neighborhood? Yeah, there we go. We just figured that out today. It's like the 2nd time in the last 3 months that has happened to me, where someone's been like, "Yeah, I think I live in your neighborhood." I just didn't realize. That was a very fun experience. Now, I think the starting point for this conversation is just the fact that we're dealing with cloud-based environments makes security more challenging than native. Right? We no longer have the opportunity, or for those of us who have entirely cloud-based environments, you don't have the opportunity to keep everything under physical lock. You don't own it. It's easier to go out and deploy things. I talk to customers all of the time who every day tell me that they don't have any virtual machines in their environment. I connect the software that I work on to their environment, and all of a sudden they have 200 virtual machines, and they just had no idea that they existed. So the ability to actually go out and create things, and then really where we're going to focus today is on this 3rd point. And that's this idea of who owns the security aspect of cloud-based environments. You have your AppSec developer, you have your application developers, you have your AppSec engineers, you have your DevOps engineers, you have your security focused engineers, you have your IT team. And all of them are working in this singular environment. And the question kind of becomes, who owns it? And this is a question I'm not going to answer right now, but I'd love to hear from you guys again. Inside of your organization, who's responsible for security at the application level? At the application level? Anybody? Everyone? That's fair. That was my, go-to at the end. But like, let's say like, anybody have a team member who thinks strongly that it's one person or another?
It's a shared responsibility for sure.
It is definitely a shared responsibility, but there's been a survey, and there's been this survey every year. I picked 2021 purely because the numbers were the easiest to ingest. And so I was like, okay, perfect. I'm going to go ahead and grab those numbers. Google honestly threw it up for me, linked the article, made it very easy. But they do this survey very regularly. Back in 2021, only 29% of respondents to a GitLab survey said that everyone should be responsible. 21% believed it was on the developers, and 12% believed it was on security operations or on the operations. So there is a difference of opinion when it comes to who's really responsible for this at the end of the day. And the next piece we're going to talk about is why does any of this matter, right? Like, let's talk about some real world examples of how this becomes so impactful into organizations. And so this was one of my favorite charts that I found, and this is the fact that APIs inside of AWS, the number of APIs inside of AWS has grown exponentially, or grew exponentially from around 2016 to 2022, which essentially meant that every year there was an increased number of attack vectors and attack opportunities that people could take advantage of as a result. And so everything that we put into the cloud, all the code that ends up going out in there, the level of importance around security of it is increased, because as the opportunity space goes up, the number of attacks is going to go up. And this is a slide I stole from work, but I do like that quote a lot. And so that is, this is specifically talking about public exposure, public access within cloud-based environments, and the amount of risk associated with public access. Not only are we talking about putting applications and application code inside of the cloud, but oftentimes what that's also going to lead to is the result, or as a result, is that an increased amount of data is also stored in cloud-based environments. If there are then risks in those applications, there is better access to that data as a result. But really, the whole reason that I put this in here, and it is being cut off by our lovely image of ourselves here in the corner, is this particular finding from Google Cloud Research was that there is an 82% reduction in security defects in production by shifting left in security. And so this is a very valuable concept if we can do it. Last piece on this just goes into some real world examples. So where have we seen essentially failures or some sort of lapse in security best practices that have led to real world impacts? Now, I will caveat this with these first two, which were pretty novel zero-day attacks, right? So I guarantee, or I can almost guarantee that, like, from a SolarWinds perspective, from a Progress perspective, it wasn't that they weren't doing anything, right? It wasn't that they didn't maybe have like a SaaS DAS tool, they didn't have an SCA tool in place, they weren't doing peer reviews on their code. However, I will also caveat that with the fact that, again, I connect to customer environments every day. One of the most common vulnerabilities I still see in customer environments that we'll go looking for is Log4Shell. And I work in the commercial and SMB space. Like half the companies I talk to didn't even exist when Log4Shell. So I'm not really sure how we're still there. But every day there are still companies releasing products, releasing code, releasing different cloud environments that include what at the time were pretty novel zero-day vulnerabilities that we're well aware of at this point. And so we still do have those risks going on. And then this last one from Uber is also really interesting because we'll talk about this. We'll talk about this one as well, or we'll talk about kind of the importance of secret identification in For Uber in 2022, someone had stored their AWS credentials in a GitHub repository. That repository was made public or accessed in some way, and it led to the compromise of over 57 million consumers' data and 600,000 drivers on the Uber platform. And this one really surprised me because I remember the movement transfer vulnerability, I remember the SolarWinds attack, and I do not remember the Uber instance. So I don't know if anyone else does, and I just didn't pay close enough attention. That's another one of those items that I think, we think a lot when we think about security and we think about code security in terms of vulnerabilities. We think about things like, are you essentially handling situations correctly in custom written code so that way someone can't throw like a buffer overflow attack in a clear text field, or they can't do something else against what you've written. But I think what often goes sort of unnoticed or what doesn't get talked about enough is how vulnerable you are just because someone puts the wrong information in the wrong place. They hard code the wrong thing somewhere. It ends up getting access, and it leads to very rapid exposure inside of your environment. All right. Now let's talk about the tools that are available to help manage some of these situations. The first thing to talk about is how does this happen in the first place, right? So what factors go in to creating or increasing risk inside of development pipelines? So I wrote a couple down here, things like increased speed to market. Trying to be first into the market means that essentially you have to work faster. When you work faster, you tend to cut corners. Complexity, legacy systems, using insecure APIs or insufficient error handling. You got AI code generation. A bunch of people don't even write their own code. They're just like, yeah, that looks good, sounds good, let's roll. There's a whole bunch of factors that go into it. Anyone else got anything that maybe I didn't include up here? You can see the last three is 3 question marks. That is not something specific. It is an opportunity for feedback, right? What things am I not thinking about? So I wrote this list myself.
Yeah,
Compliance.
Compliance.
We talked about it at USCW about people not storing the code properly, securely, just kind of posting it, putting it somewhere and not putting a password on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Not securing your code properly or using public repositories. People make repositories public by accident at the same time. That's just like how easy it is to publicly expose a virtual machine or an S3 bucket or something in your cloud environment. It's also very, very easy to publicly expose your GitHub repository. And so that can happen very rapidly as well. Emily, do you have something?
I was thinking, I know that sounds simple, but if developers were to be low on sleep or to be coding for so many hours that they not human factor of tiredness.
Absolutely. Human factor of tiredness. Developers working late. Anyone in here a developer? Or a developer? What time do you start your day? If you had your choice, what time would you start your day? Yeah, I mean, I worked with plenty of developers. I was a developer for a very short period of my life. I'll be forefront with you guys. I was not a because I drove everyone I worked with nuts because this is me, right? Like I am this person. I'm the talk to everybody guy at work. And I would go up to everybody and be like, hey, how you doing? And they just want to sit there and get their work done at the end of the day. I think I was fine at it otherwise. I think all my coworkers hated me. Most of them, or many of them that I knew, if they could choose their to start their day like no earlier than 11 a.m., that was the way to go. And they were happy to work late into the evening. They'll work as late as possible for as long as possible. They'll drink a couple monsters along the way, and we'll see what happens. And so I think that's a very real aspect. People make mistakes. I used to teach security plus for the Navy. I don't know if anyone actually read the bio that I had to write up. I did that in like 20 minutes. But I used to teach security plus for the Navy. And that's what we used to talk about all the time. Humans are the biggest risk factor in any aspect of security. You can put the best guardrails in place, and you can't stop someone from clicking on a potentially malicious link because they didn't realize that they did not, in fact, win the lottery this time. So some of the tools. So I put 4 tools. I know that there are others, but I did put 4 tools. I also just picked 5 logos per slide. So I also recognize that there are more vendors and providers that do some of these things. But I picked 4 tools specifically just to talk quickly about them and talk about sort of the value that they introduce. So the first is static application security testing. This will often be referred to as SaaS specifically. And this is where you're actually analyzing your custom code for risks that it would introduce. And there's a main difference to that between that and software composition analysis, which is 2 slides from now, being that that is based on the code that you actually wrote, testing against the stuff that your developers created. And some of the companies that do that, the most common one or the 2 most well-known, at least in my world, would be Sneak and Checkmarks. There's also Veracode, Psycode, Sonar, and there's a bunch of others as well. The second that I went with was dynamic application security testing. This is actually validating or testing against code in runtime. So this is where you actually launch it into some sort of development environment. You test against it. You try to see if it's susceptible to any of the vulnerabilities or other risks that you believe it may be susceptible to as a result in just an automated fashion. Again, you can see some of the logos repeat. Checkmarks is here as well, as is Veracode. We also introduced Rapid7 here, Synopsys, Intruder. And then we talk about some of the other methods of doing this. So those 2 are probably the most dynamic. They're the ones that probably most are familiar with from a testing perspective. But we also have a few other options. There's software composition analysis. This is where you're testing and you're saying, am I using any packages that introduce known risk? So my Log4Shell example previously, where I have a bunch of customers who do this on a regular basis, if they were using maybe a software composition analysis tool, they may catch that ahead of time, realizing that they're using a particular Java library or whatever it might be that does have dependencies and therefore introduces certain risk. Again, repeat vendors of Sneak, self-servingly, I put myself in here with Wiz, FOSSA, JFrog, Synopsys. And then the last was secret scanning. And I threw a little bit of extra on here because we already talked about it a little bit. But I found this really interesting. While I was preparing to do this today, I went out and did some research. And one of the things that I found was that here at NC State, they actually performed essentially just different variations of scanning against public GitHub repositories. They just ran out, they ran a couple tools, and they were searching to see, how fast can we uncover secrets that people leave in public repositories? And they found that the mean time to discovery was all of 20 seconds, which essentially means that if you accidentally post a secret inside of a public repository, unless you catch it in about 20 seconds, there's a good chance it's already been compromised. And so that was kind of the craziest statistic that I found while doing this. And so secret scanning is going to analyze your code. It's going to analyze the files associated with your code and see, did you hard code secrets in any location? Or did you put them in a variable file that's accessible as a result? And what that can lead to. And so there's, again, a number of tools that do that. We have Prisma that's up in the top right from Palo Alto, Spectral, Wiz, GitHub Advanced Security, which actually could have gone on all of these slides, I think, at least SaaS, secret scanning, and FCA, and then GitLeaks.
Nice. While you're going on the secret scan, isn't that was this new list feature? Isn't that part of the code file?
It is. We have other ways to do it too, but it is a newer feature from Wiz in particular. But there's a bunch of tools that have been doing it. One of the things that I will talk to in my day-to-day job, and I'll kind of say all the time, is that there's only so many ways to slice an apple when it comes to doing things like secret scanning, SaaS, DAS, SCA. For the most part, a lot of these tools are going to work very similarly. It's a question of, does it meet your organization's needs? And that's kind of what we're about to talk about right now, is does it meet your organization's needs in terms of what it's able to search for, what it's able to search against, and the level to which it's able to be customized, I think is another big factor that is. You have a question about?
So I see your picture, like I think in the software composition and later, and not in static and dynamic analysis. So do you think they are not as important or like?
I don't get to make the product decisions.
Could you please repeat?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, question was, do I personally, or does Wiz in general? Okay, yeah, so does Wiz in general think that, SAS and DAS are not as important as SCA and secret scan? And I would say no. I think that we recognize, like, that the organization, right, recognizes that there are avenues still to go from various perspectives. I think one of the things we're also going to talk about here is that security in general, but also specifically like code security and shift left security are not I'm gonna put I used to be a project manager, so I'm gonna put that hat on for a second. They're not a project, right? A project has a defined start and end date. That is the definition of a project. I'm gonna go back to when I worked at CrowdStrike, they called me a program manager. They called me a program manager because most of the projects did not, in fact, have defined start and end dates. We had projects inside of programs where we were aligned to programs. I myself was aligned to endpoint detection and response. And it was a continuous evaluation. It's a continuous evolution. So you have to start somewhere. Wiz happened to start with SCA and secret scanning. There are potential roadmap items to go into SAS DAS. I have no idea. I can't comment onto whether or not we will, right? I do know that we allow you to bring your own from a number of different vendors as an aspect because we recognize the importance of it. It's just not a functionality we offer right now.
Why did you leave that open source scanning part on the SAST and DAST? I mean, the shift left actually we do the open source analysis and the SBOMs, software bill of materials as the initial thing for software conversion analysis.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
So why did you leave the open source scanning in between the software composition analysis and SAST and DAST?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bunch of tools that do both. There are various aspects. I was trying to focus kind of on the key differentiators of them. The main thing, or the main thing I would say was like SAS and DAST that differentiates it from like an SCA. Because an SCA will scan for those open source vulnerabilities, it scans those packages, but that's all, right? There are aspects in SAS and DAST programs will do that as well, but its primary focus or its key differentiator between that and just an SCA tool is going to be the fact that it will also scan your custom configuration, your custom code as well. So I was just trying to call out kind of the key differentiators between the various tools.
So does the software bill of materials as well?
It does. All right, so now time for the fun part, right? Why and how to shift left. And as we said at the beginning of the conversation, it's not an easy answer, right? I can't give you guys a product today. I can't sell you Wiz. I can't sell you anything else. That is my day-to-day. It's what I try to do most of the time, right? But I can't do it for this particular problem because it depends on your organization. So the first thing we have to think about is how do we put essentially enough guardrails in place, or how do we put the right guardrails? What we're not trying to do is be a blocker. If you be a blocker, the whole thing's going to blow. I've been in plenty of situations as a project manager where I've been working with engineering teams, or even all the way back as an engineer myself, where guardrails became blockers, and as a result, they became workarounds, right? If you get blocked by something, there's always a way to get around it. There's always someone who can sign a form that says, you know what, it's good enough, I don't care, let's get it out the door. And so when you create a guardrail that becomes the blocker, that's what you invite, essentially. You invite people trying to circumnavigate the situation and figure out, how do I get around it? How do I do something else so that I don't have to deal with the situation I'm currently in? And so you want them to be guardrails. You want them to be properly scoped to protect them, but not to be overly influential to what they're trying to do. And so some of the things you have to keep in mind as you consider, first and foremost, and this is probably the hardest one to achieve on this list, how do we achieve trust between security and development? I went to, again, back when I was a project manager, I went to the PMP conference in Hartford, Connecticut, in like 2016, right? And I saw a woman speak, and it has stayed with me to this day. And she said, relationships or like marriage and work is very simple, right? There are 5 love languages, and those 5 love languages translate directly into how people like to be treated. And to this day, I still use it. right? It's like people love getting gifts, they love compliments, they love acts of physical touch, although be careful. They love all, there's different things that everyone wants to be treated as. And so building trust between your development and security teams is going to depend on your organization. It's going to depend on the level of relationship you already have. And the first piece in my mind might be figuring out, how do we create that relationship? What is it? How is it that they want me to interact? Because if you go in there and you just start slamming things and saying, nope, we're doing security now. And by the way, I bought a SaaS vendor, I bought a DAS vendor, I bought an SCA tool, and I bought a secret scanning tool. And if you don't pass any of it, this code isn't going out the door. That's when we get to the roadblock situation. And they're pretty much going to shut you down from the start. Introducing security-minded culture into your dev teams. I think that goes into the first one. Again, it's probably one of the more difficult aspects is how do we make sure that this fits right? Getting full visibility into your environment, understanding where do I have potential security risks. That's really going to go into which security risks do I really need to focus on. There are thousands of vulnerabilities that could exist. There are, hundreds of misconfigurations, whatever that might be that could exist. I need to be able to identify which ones do I actually want to bother my dev team with and which ones do I want to let slide for the time. Cleaning up and essentially establishing a baseline from which to start. Understanding who owns what. I'm sure that this has happened to everyone, whether it's in your work environment or your home life, where someone comes to you and they're like, what are you doing? You have no idea what they're talking about. Like my wife does it to me all the time. She's like, hey, what did you do with this? And I have no idea what she's talking about. Honestly, most of the time, it's probably my fault. And I just did not realize it at the time. But essentially she thinks that I own something. I don't realize that I own something or I don't own something. And that essentially leads to a conflict and it goes all the way back up to the top where it starts to degrade that level of trust. And then know which controls matter. This is going to be about evaluating. It's going to be about that baseline aspect. Do you need all 4 tools? Do you need a subset of tools? Is there a place you want to start from? Is there a threshold that you're willing to accept? And starting and working to define what those things are so that, again, you're not being overly restrictive. And I don't actually, this is again another slide that I stole from work in a much salesier version of this discussion. But I don't really love this, right? And that's because it really looks at this from like a waterfall-based approach. It looks like it continuously grows. And the answer is that it really doesn't. There are aspects that will start and they will grow for longer periods of time. Things like top-down initiative from leadership. Get leadership buy-in. Get someone who essentially has the power to say, this matters to us now. And so that way you at least have some level of backing when you go into those conversations. But even that can change. That can be iterative. I'm sure we've all been somewhere where your CTO leaves or your CISO leaves or somebody leaves who was the champion of that particular process. And now you're going to start it again. You got to make sure that it matters to the next person. You're fitting into their expectations. Getting your teams on board and establishing baselines, also probably moving targets. Teams change, baselines change, right? How do we measure? So now we need, once we essentially say we're going to start doing something, how do we measure success? How do we realize that this is working? And how do we get better as a result? Automation of the process. Now, that's really why we talked about those tools. When I was a developer for that short period of time, I was working at Northrop Grumman. Every Tuesday and Thursday, we had 4-hour code review. Just pure code review. It was like all the tools that existed for us at the time. We were working in a SCIF, so that may have been the problem, right? But we had 2 4-hour blocks a week. We took like the best and brightest of that particular team at Northrop Grumman. It was all of our principal software engineers. We stuck them in a room and like you just had to trot over there with your laptop. Like, I'm going to show you the 10 lines of code changes that I made. It was very uncomfortable for everyone involved, and it was a time suck. And as a result, I don't know if they still do it to this day, but I could see very easily that being phased out. We don't have time for the code review this week, but that's a rapid change we have to make. Let's go ahead and push it forward. And then finally, improve. And this is where I think, we should have done this in this. Share and improve. This is an ever-evolving process. Just because something starts working or works today doesn't mean it's going to work tomorrow. Just because you feel secure today doesn't mean you're going to be secure tomorrow. There can be a certain threshold that you set within your environment that basically says, I'm okay with a couple critical vulnerabilities. And then your log4shell vulnerabilities get released. Your regression SSH vulnerabilities get released. Your SolarWinds vulnerabilities get released. And you start to say, I'm not okay with those ones being the critical ones though. And so that process of what is your baseline? How do I do this? What tools am I introducing? Is again, it's not a defined, it doesn't have a defined ending. It's a continuous process that you need to continually evaluate inside of your environment. And then this goes back to the point I was going to hope was sort of my ending exciting punchline. There's one more after this now. So we still have that, right? And that is the fact that this is everyone's responsibility. Just because and again, that's because of that same way that secure code security is an evolving process. Security in general, as we know, is an evolving process. If I ship secure code today, it's not necessarily secure tomorrow. And that's the aspect that needs to be continuously evaluated. So you have your dev teams continuously working on new code. They need to, or the goal here would be that what they're providing, what they're shipping out as product is as secure as possible, or it's meeting your guardrails that you put in place. But you also need your security team, your DevOps teams, and your other teams continuously evaluating what do we have out there. And then making decisions that go back to the dev team, because these people are still responsible for putting out new code. And you still want them to put out secure new code. So they're continuously having to develop. They're continuously being forced with timelines. You still want them to go through the whole process. And so you do have to be selective, right? You have to say that, and this is where that full visibility aspect comes in. What do I need them to go back and fix? What code cleanup aspects are most important? And what do I want them to focus on? Because that's going to fit in like a 2-week sprint. If this is a 2-week sprint, we have this whole block right here, this dev team A block. It's going to fit in like somewhere at most like halfway between A and the end of the block. That's the time that most dev teams are given for any kind of code cleanup or fixes. And that's just because they didn't really plan their sprint fully and they ended up with some free time at the end of the 2 weeks. So we need to make sure that we can fit as best as possible into that time frame. And then my last slide is it possible? The answer is yes. The answer is also it's not easy, right? Said it a couple times, I'll say it one more time. There is no secret sauce for this. There is no way that you can go in tomorrow and say, I found the perfect product, I did this. Maybe you did for your organization, and that's great. Share that with the class. But it is going to be an evolving process. But it is possible, and it will make your organizations more secure at the end of the day.
Are there any questions from the speaker?
Just on Wiz marketing stuff. Show us what Wiz is doing.
I was told not to.
Oh. Oh, that was great.
He can follow up with you, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But
And he was welcome to say my contact.
so, Max, I have one question. I don't know whether you're the right person to answer.
Yeah.
Why did Wiz walk away from Google acquisition of 20?
I don't know. I'm not the right person because I was looking at the meager amount of shares that I.
Can you stop recording?
Oh.
I can edit the record.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, you're not with us on YouTube.
Let me stop it.
Yeah. Don't worry, you're not in a stop. I'm going to say nice things. Yeah, I was looking at my meager amount of shares.